These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Friends, a pleasant good evening to you. This is These Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. It is the evening of the 21st of March, 2021, and I am here in Austin, Texas, broadcasting out to you. I am really excited. Tonight is the 10th production of the podcast, and I'm going to be sharing an original essay that I've written, and then we'll let that take us where it's going to go. I've titled this essay Nuance, written by Russell Cordell Staker. Recently, I revisited a particular scene in Mel Stuart's 1971 musical fantasy, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Of a heavy evening, the poor paper boy, Charlie Bucket, arrives at the laundry where his mother, Mrs. Bucket, is working late. He offers to walk her home, but the impromptu visit is really intended to lessen the burden of his own broken heart. Mrs. Bucket unfortunately cannot leave her work, and so Charlie turns to go just as abruptly as he arrived. She rises wearily from stirring a vat of soaking shirts with a wooden ladle and says, "Stay a minute. Here, pull up a pile of clothes and sit down." He does so. She is sensible to his hidden burden and softly asks, "Everything all right at school?" "Yep," he says. "Good. Did you go on your newspaper route today?" "Just finished," he says. "Good," says Mrs. Bucket. And then this simple, unattractive woman in a besweated, starch blue work dress, remarkably beautiful in her humility, pauses, looks up, and waits for her son Charlie to go on with what is there for him to reveal. The boy has an expression of supreme discouragement upon his thoughtful face. He grabs hold of the long wooden ladle in the laundry pot and screws up his brow, licks his lips, and then comes forth with the pain of words. "I wanted to tell you something." "Oh," says Mrs. Bucket. "They found the third ticket today." "Did they?" Mrs. Bucket retorts. "Yeah." Charlie lowers his face. "Well, I guess I'll be going now," he says, and zips up his coat. Mrs. Bucket asks, "Is that all?" Charlie, walking away, turns and responds, "I thought you'd like to know. Most people are pretty interested. I know I'm interested. There are only 2 tickets left, you know, just 2. Pretty soon, just 1. Mrs. Bucket pauses. She twists a saturated shirt free of its soapy water and ponders aloud, "I wonder who the lucky ones will be." Now the fury in Charlie's pain is present, and he confides, "Well, in case you're wondering if it'll be me, it won't be. Just in case you're wondering. You can count me out." Mrs. Bucket steps forth and puts her hands on her son's shoulders and says, "Oh, Charlie, there are 100 billion people in this world, and only 5 of them will find golden tickets. Even if you had a sack full of money, you probably wouldn't be able to find one. And after this contest is over, you'll be no different from the billions of others who didn't find one." It is here that Charlie is most vulnerable. He looks up into the eyes of his concerned mother and with great honest courage says, "But I am different. I want it more than any of them." "Charlie," she says, "you'll get your chance. One day things will change." "When?" he asks. "When will they change?" Mrs. Bucket says with magnificent tenderness, "Probably when you least expect it." She blinks, leans down to her son, and kisses his cheek. She dare not say more because she knows what he is up against. Mrs. Bucket's wise restraint is her manner of protecting Charlie's pure heart. An ache of bitterness and sweetness reflects itself in the expression of her face. In spite of her utter limitations and all the wisdom of her long years, she would bear his burden if only she could. But she allows him to carry the weight of it just as it must be borne, and alone. What she can do, and does, is watch and wait in the wings of his unique stage as he proceeds forth once again out into the world. As Charlie walks on, Mrs. Bucket steps out of the laundry and sits on the steps to watch him go. In the form of a song, she issues a gentle wish at his heels. "Cheer up, Charlie." Charlie Bucket walks the lonely and crooked streets on home. His intelligence grants no quarter to the obvious and hard truth he perceives. His own sensibility metes out a measure of sharp pain and equal understanding with each step. He accepts all of it just as it must be, but never to the point of diminishing the hope of a dream in his purest heart. He sees the world as it really is, and even as it ought to be, and finds himself exactly where he is within it, somewhere in between. His value is intact, even in its insignificance, and his noblest courage is in admitting these delicate shades of meaning to himself. He knows the golden ticket is just a piece of paper, and maybe it alone cannot fully provide proof of the sort of imagination he will keep for himself. And so he lets it go. He can walk another day along the line of the gray curtain of a weary and indifferent world. Not long ago, I awoke from lousy sleep. I had been having some nonsensical dream that left me confused, and within which I heard Mrs. Bucket singing "Cheer Up, Charlie" over and over again in a loop. The music had a faint, tinny quality to it, as if it were muffled behind some heavy door from some considerable distance. There have been plenty of dreams in which songs play in my mind, and I usually think nothing of them. But for some reason I felt impelled to go downstairs and find the particular scene I've just described above. Nothing profound came in watching it again. I know the scene well from many years of viewing it throughout my life. Maybe it was the familiarity of the setting and the kind-hearted message of hope in heavy times that calmed me, but I didn't think too hard about it. I closed my laptop, got a drink of water, and returned to bed. Over the ensuing days, I kept thinking about the scene at the laundry between Charlie and Mrs. Bucket. What interested me was a texture inside of the narrative. There is nothing complicated there. What is shown is obvious and more than evident in its sequence, but it triggered a consideration I've had in mind for some time about shadings of meaning, or rather essences of humanness, where the light sort of trails off and leaves a delicate sensibility to something usually in plain sight but not altogether obvious to see. I don't know that Roald Dahl or Mel Stewart were trying to say or show more in that particular moment than they did, but what I rediscovered was the acute recognition of my own face mirrored in the reflection of Charlie Bucket, or rather his face in mine. It reminded me of something Walt Whitman often considered when viewing any other human being along the course of his own life, that we are all, in the end, just a little bit of each other, that our histories and hopes are all inextricably intertwined. That a greater reward comes when our own sensibility changes perspective with an outlook far broader than the one we started out with. I thought of a single word. Many years ago, I flew from Atlanta to Brussels. At 37,000 feet through the gloaming, I chased ethereal light along a voluble horizon until suddenly it brightened into pale morning just over the North Sea. Glimpsing milky-hued cerulean water through a thin silkscreen as the Boeing 767 began its descent, I prepared for a long, unobstructed gaze over Belgium. A pleasant fragrance wafted proximal to my nose, and I looked away from the window. The sinewy stewardess I'd wondered about during the night passed and gated down the aisle to the main cabin. She turned and looked right at me and lifted the telephone mouthpiece to her fine face, wherein she fluently announced, first in liquid French, then in guttural Dutch, and finally in received pronunciation English, preparations for landing. I listened intently, watching closely, as her lovely mouth shaped the sound of each word in an effortless lilt. When she gracefully concluded and returned the telephone to its hook, the sound of the Rolls-Royce RB211 engine seemed far away. I returned my gaze to the alabaster veil beyond the plexiglass and waited. The broad wing dipped, and there beneath the cloud deck of a gray morning were red rooftops as far as I could see. I was stunned. The bright shock of a deeply embedded emotional memory rose vividly in my mind. Years before, framed inside the small screen of a Zenith television set I had placed atop a card table in my bedroom closet, I peered out of the pristine glass of the Wonkavator and saw the original red rooftops of Munich, identical to the ones I was looking at through the glass of the big descending jet I rode all the way into Brussels. Instinctively, I whispered the lyric, "If you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it." I thought of Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka, and Jack Albertson as Grandpa Joe, and Peter Ostrom as Charlie Bucket, and Russ Staker as an 8-year-old version of his contemporary self, all hovering together right there above a mysterious chocolate factory. Only we weren't marveling at that. Below was a propinquitous range of vision, as messy and as full of memory and as unfinished and gloriously real and imagined as any we might have known. The wonder of everyday streets and routine movements and patterns of lives being lived in languages foreign to our own was profound. The real mystery lay just under every red rooftop. As I reflected upon this, I discerned that there, in every small space of the drab world, inside every dank and loathsome alleyway and crooked sidewalk, in every difficult choice and untold disappointment, and in all of this world's terribly absurd and history, an articulate and life-affirming shade of perspective resides and replenishes every hope and dream. As the 767 lurched into Zaventem and came to a full stop at the gate, I promised myself not to dismiss any of it. Somehow, if I paid close enough attention to every banal intricacy in any small hour, I was sure to get a glimpse of paradise. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. RCS 20 March 2021. That is my essay for this evening. Boy, there was a lot that went into this, and this one, this took me to some interesting spots as I was writing, and I want to dig into a few of these things. Coming to Willy Wonka, just in a general sense, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, it began for me in 1982 in Caldwell, Idaho, and the film triggered my desire to read the book, which I did after. So I didn't read the book first. I saw the film first, and I'm going to get into some of that. But I want to give a little context, because there was a lot that went into the reason why I wrote about Nuance, and felt really impelled and guided to use this sequence with Willy Wonka, because I think it really helped me to better understand why that was important to me and what I was discovering as I investigated into this a little bit. First and foremost, 1982, I was 8 years of age, and just as a couple little highlights of pop culture that were big to me at that particular time, to give a little bit of texture here, is that I remember at that year, Michael Jackson released the album Thriller, and one of my favorite songs, and actually my favorite song on that album, is Human Nature, which kind of subtly was a bit of a song that, as I was writing this, was underneath the Willy Wonka sequencing. And just the lyrics of Human Nature and that song really took me back to quite an interesting time in my youth. And I was very, an 8-year-old is very aware of a broader world and impressionable. And I was taking in a lot of color at that point in my life, and I think that's a big reason why Willy Wonka stuck so deeply. And as I'm going to get into that, I also remember that was the year that Epcot opened up in Disney World. I'd never actually been to Disney. It was the very next year that our family went to Disneyland in California. We didn't make it to Florida until many, many years later, but in 83, the following year, we went to Disneyland. But I remember reading all about Epcot, and I was just thrilled with this idea of this place that, had this big golf ball looking thing. And, this idea that Disney could create an environment where all the world came to Disney and you could go experience that. I thought that was really cool. And I also remember in the following year in 83, I went to my very first professional baseball game, where I saw the California Angels play the Baltimore Orioles, and I think the Angels won 3-2. At least that's my memory of it. But the reason why I was so excited was I'm a Dodgers fan first, but of course love the Angels, and of course the California Angels. They were the California Angels then. They're the LA Angels now. They were the Anaheim Angels for a while. They've kind of changed their title, but Rod Carew was the first baseman at that time, and I loved Rod Carew. He was just an exceptionally good baseball player and a very fine human being. I think he's like 75, 76 right now. Just a great guy, and so I got to see Rod Carew, and that was amazing. I remember gas was really cheap, and I actually looked this up. Gas in that year was 91 cents, and two movies that also stuck out that year were E.T. by Steven Spielberg and Chariots of Fire. It was one of the first adult kind of movies that I went, or grown-up movies. I shouldn't say adult movie, but a grown-up movie that I went with my mom and actually sat through, and that movie just had a huge impression on me. So all of this is swirling in the background of 82, but if I were to pick one particular impression that really came all the way to the top of the surface, it was my discovery of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Let me give you a little bit of background on that. In 1971, the film was produced by David L. Wolper, and it was directed by Mel Stewart. The screenplay was actually written by the author, Roald Dahl. I did not, I guess I kind of knew that, but as I was researching this, I was pleasantly surprised because, as I'm going to get into this here in a minute, Roald Dahl disavowed the film. He just did not care for it, and but he did write the screenplay, and it was his novel, which was published in 1964, and the title of the novel was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So it wasn't Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. They changed that a little bit. What is most fascinating to me about the film is the music. That and, of course, Gene Wilder. The cast across the board was amazing, but it was the music, which was done by the inimitable Leslie Bricusse. Anthony Newley, and Walter Scarf. And Leslie Bricusse is a personal family favorite of mine. He's a brilliant songwriter, composer, lyricist, playwright. He's 90 years of age, still living, and he's from Pinner, Great Britain. And a film that I've touched on in a podcast prior to this was that has had a huge influence on my life was he wrote and composed all of the magnificent music set to the 1970 Ronald Neame film entitled Scrooge, which stars Albert Finney and Sir Alec Guinness, and it's of course based on the 1843 masterwork of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So I was familiar with Leslie Bricusse, not at that time by name because I wouldn't have known who he was, but I was familiar with his music because of Scrooge. And every Christmas Eve, that is a movie that our family always watched. And so the music of Scrooge, from as far back as I can remember, is the soundtrack of my life. And there were very distinct sound qualities in the melodies and in the messaging of the music of Willy Wonka that just immediately resonated with me. So when I saw it, even though I didn't know it was Leslie Bricusse, and of course I learned this later, it just connected with me. And it was the music that really linked me emotionally and deeply, intimately to that story. And I want to read, as I was writing the essay, I wrote a big bunch of pages in drafting. And I want to actually read part of a draft that never made it into the essay, but I think it gives a little texture here. And this is what I wrote. I titled this little sequence, and I have all these little snippets. But as I was looking at this, I thought, I'm going to read this too. In the spring of 1982, I moved a small Zenith color television set into my bedroom closet and set it atop a card table. I wanted to secure a deliciously cozy place where I would not be disturbed by my younger sisters for the proper viewing of a most intriguing film I had seen advertised for primetime broadcast on NBC. The film was called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And from the preview I had seen just days before, it struck me as curiously peculiar and possibly frightening. Naturally, anything to do with chocolate was a given, but it had the sense of something far more thrilling, and I was not going to miss it. The show begins with the wondrous pealing of chiming melodic bells, pronouncing what feels like the coming of Christmas in a crescendoed tintinnabulation soon met in time by articulate horns and thereafter the soft elegance of strings. As the music filled the small open space of my closet, which was, as memory retains itself, oddly hued in a purple light stemming from the pink sky of early evening pouring in from the window above my bed on the opposite wall, and blending with the light blue of my room, I watched the opening credits roll. Chocolate was being formed. Its creation from cocoa beans through to a churning and shiny viscous liquid and then solidified and molded into various delectable confectionaries, the last version of which was the iconic Wonka bar itself, mesmerized me. At that precise moment, I was no longer watching a film. I was participating in a dream. I was Charlie Bucket and he was me. The television screen was merely a glass portal into a lived experience I somehow already understood. Though the explanation for this will hardly be believable, it remains true, and not because I have any proof to demonstrate it, but simply because the vision I was taking in hinted at questions that nudged me further into gentler, more nuanced ones, which often come only in the language of the senses rather than pedestrian words and in the recollection of faraway memories from other dimensions. So as I wrote there, and you get a little flavor of what showed up in the original essay, which I read obviously at the very beginning, that was the trigger for the desire to write about nuance. Now, nuance is a word that I, of late, over the last couple of years, particularly in a lot of the deep reading that I'm doing, has been very curious to me. And I've wanted to understand it more, but I wanted to apply that word in a way that made deeper sense to me within those articulate shades of sensibility. So that's where that came from. And as I'm hearing this music and just the experience of participating in the dream of this vision of David L. Wolper's and Mel Stewart's vision of Roald Dahl's book, which, they produced into this film, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, I was very smitten. I was taken away, and it carried me into a realm and a world that I, prior to that, probably really aside from Star Wars, I have very vivid memories as a little boy. That came out when I was 3. My parents took me to see Star Wars at a drive-in theater and propped me up in their car at a drive-in so I could see that. And I have distinct memories seeing that. I don't remember, of course, all the story, but I do remember seeing Darth Vader. I called him Mouth Sater, and the white guys is what I called it. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. But Willy Wonka was really this film that took me to a realm I'd never experienced before. I did some reading about this, and as I was kind of thinking back on my memory back in 1982 when I saw this on broadcast television, because the film itself, which came out in 71, was not a big blockbuster. But because of television syndication, it really started to take off. And it's basically always been on TV ever since. But at that particular time, I mean, this is pre-cable days. I remember seeing ads for it, and I was blown away. So when it was put on NBC, I didn't want to miss it. And in my mind, I'm probably getting the channels wrong, but I seem to remember it was Channel 4. But anyway, let me fast forward here a little bit. Tim Burton told in an interview a while back, he was talking about what drew him to the film and the story as well that Roald Dahl created, but particularly within the film. And the idea that Tim Burton said was that children can be adults. And when I read that, I thought, man, that's exactly what I felt. I didn't put into words, but as an 8-year-old, when I watched the story, what I recognized and what was very clear to me was the fact that these children that get these golden tickets and go into this mysterious chocolate factory were as dynamic as any adult was going to be. And the adult seemed almost childlike. It was a reverse of roles, and it really came across very clearly to me. I wouldn't have been able to express it, but I certainly felt it. And when Tim Burton talked about that children can be adults, to me it was very meaningful. So Roald Dahl's novel, through Gene Wilder and the Leslie Bricusse film, what we see is this interplay back and forth. And as I'd mentioned, Dahl disavowed the film. He felt that it just wasn't up to par. And so the film didn't do very well. And then all of a sudden, in about 1972, after it had been out for a year, it began to take on cult status due to television. And in 2014, it was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. And I'm taking this from a quote that I read. And particularly because of the wonder that it creates. And so Gene Wilder gave an interview, and I'm giving a couple of little bullets here, so stick with me because this is going to come together and why I wrote the essay. And this is not about Willy Wonka, but you're going to see where I'm going to take this. Wilder discussed his reason for actually accepting the role of playing Willy Wonka himself. And if everybody's seen it, but if you think back on that film, what does he do when he walks out of the gate at the very beginning while the children are waiting for him to arrive? He comes out with his cane, his stick, and he has a very noticeable hitch in his step, a hobble. And he's got a very dour look on his face, and he walks, and there's the click of the cane as it goes into the cobbled ground that he's walking. There's this rolled out carpet for him. And there's a hush in the crowd. Everybody's waiting because, there's this wonderful occasion. These selected children get to go into the chocolate factory, and all of a sudden, the man himself steps out from the building, and he doesn't at all look cheery, and he's pretty scary. And he slowly paces forward, and then he gets to that point where the cane gets stuck in one of the cobbled stones. And in getting stuck, it comes loose from his hand, and Willy Wonka steps forward, Gene Wilder, and then there's that pregnant pause, and he does a beautiful tumble somersault roll, jumps up on his feet, and his face comes alight. And all of a sudden, we get the Willy Wonka that we assumed was going to be there. And of course, there's this fanfare and all the music takes off. Well, Willy Wonka, or Gene Wilder, talked about that. And he said that from that time on, no one will know if I'm lying or telling the truth. And he was insistent that be put in the film. Otherwise, he wasn't going to do it. And I thought that's marvelous. It's genius because it is so apropos to why it was Willy Wonka was who he was. But this goes back to what I said earlier. It's the role reversal where the adults almost seem childlike and the children seem adults. And Willy Wonka walked both sides of that very, very effectively. Again, I thought of nuance, and I thought of irony. And as I sat in that closet with that little Zenith TV propped up on the card table and watching it, in this rapturous moment, what I'm seeing is a painted picture that added to something that was forming in my mind. It was the background of Dahl's imagination, which, I did after I saw the film. I was absolutely convinced I had to read the book. And so I went to the Caldwell Public Library and I checked out Roald Dahl's book to, read it, because I thought, well, I'm going to get more of that. And, The Secretive Chocolate Factory, with its immense buildings and the odd goings on, coupled with what the film shaded, and this is where I'm using the word shading, that I kind of plug in with this idea of nuance, is that there was a darker, more curious heart of my own sense of a world and its vast complexity. And I think that what was effective about that film is that it starts to pull that in. And I was becoming more aware of that. Within the film itself, and to go back to Leslie Bricusse just briefly, were two particular songs that still remain. They're songs that I sing, or they bounce around in my head now and then, and I'll sing them in random places just to myself. But it's If You Want to View Paradise, or Pure Imagination by that Gene Wilder sings, and then Cheer Up Charlie, that the actress, I believe her name was Diana Soul. I put that in my notes somewhere, and I'll get to it here in a minute. But she is Mrs. Bucket. Those two songs really stuck and maintained a presence with me in talking, or at least dealing with some of the complexities of life as I was getting into it. I seem to come back to those a lot. I wanted to talk a little bit about how the factory itself is, well, let me just say this. So I'm going to fast forward in the sense of how the book ended. I remember when I read it, I checked it out of the library, I went home and I read it very, very quickly. And this is the odd thing about the book. I don't have like a huge memory of actually getting this huge sense of fulfillment from the book. And it wasn't because the story itself wasn't fulfilling. It's that it just didn't have the same emphasis that I think the film did. And later in life, as I was reading some outtakes by Roald Dahl himself, and doing some research as I was getting ready to write this particular essay, what I realized was that, Charlie at the very end of Roald Dahl's book, it's a little bit different. And I think that Roald Dahl actually was a little bit misguided in what he said. His words were, they always want to change a book storyline. What makes Hollywood think that children want the endings changed for the film when they accept it in the book? The ending in his book is that the Wonkavator at the very end, Willy Wonka finds his good person, as he describes it, and they ride in the glass elevator to Charlie's house, where, Willy Wonka invites the entire family to come and live with Willy Wonka and the Oompa Loompas in the factory for, forever and ever. And Slugworth also, by the way, is a very, very minor character. That was very different than what the film was. What I liked about the film was they don't end it that way. We launch into or out of the chocolate factory with the Wonkavator, and then we look out over the city of Munich. Well, it was filmed in Munich, but, in the imaginary city of where that takes place. And I think that Roald Dahl was a little short-sighted. I've always felt that artistry can be added unto artistry, and what he wrote was fantastic. It's a wonderful book. I'm not trying to diminish anything Roald Dahl did. It's his world. He created. He gets all the credit for it. What I like is that David L. Wolper and Mel Stewart added unto it, and then by the cast that they had with, Jack Albertson as Grandpa Joe and Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka, and the music by Leslie Bricusse, it's just phenomenal. I think about the line, look at me. I've never thought my life could be anything but a catastrophe, but suddenly I began to see a bit of good luck for me because I've got a golden ticket. I've got a golden twinkle in my eye. There's just so much there that at an early phase in life, it just seems to point to the idea that, this life can be pretty heavy, but there are these little opportunities that come along. So I got thinking about the song, and I'm going to try something a little bit different here for just a moment. I can't sing worth a damn, but I want to actually sing part of the song, Pure Imagination. And the reason for doing this isn't to flex my vocal cords here. It's because, as I'd mentioned, I do this often. This is a song that I will sing to myself. And the reason why I do is it reminds me of the light in Gene Wilder's eyes, and I see his face. And it takes me back to the place that I was in the first time I heard him sing it. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the chocolate room. Hold your breath. Make a wish. Count to 3. Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look, and you'll see into your imagination. We'll begin with a spin, traveling in the world of my creation. What we'll see will defy explanation. If you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it. Anything you want to do it. Want to change the world, there's nothing to it. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. Living there you'll be free if you truly wish to be. Now, why would I sing that in a podcast? It's exactly why I'd mentioned earlier, because it reminds me that there are depths in sound and in expression. And even for those of us, and I'm one of them that can't sing, it's something that I still do. I sing to myself often. I sing in my dreams. These things come back to me, these shades of complexity and humanness. And Gene Wilder embodied something that, as great as Roald Dahl was in creating the character Willy Wonka, would never have come to life unless Gene Wilder played it. And how often have we found that in art? Art begets art. Success begets success. And I believe that we add unto the great works. I'm not saying we have to take away from anything. I'll use myself as an example. Maybe I have created something, or someday will, that takes it to a certain level. But somebody else will come along, inspired by what it was that I created in the moment, in the sensibility that I offered, and see something even vaster, or add a sound or a quality to that that they themselves then produce. And it creates another trigger for somebody else on down. And this goes back to what I was touching on with Walt Whitman, that I think our lives and our histories are all inextricably intertwined. And again, it kept coming back to this one word, which is nuance. I want to touch on briefly the laundry scene. And the reason why that came to me was it came back in a dream. It was the reason why I started writing about it. And I think early on in one of my podcasts, I believe it was the episode or the production I called Dead Reckoning, I wrote about the fact that I have a lot of dreams, and I do. And this was a dream that came to me where it was the song of Cheer Up Charlie. And I thought about the interchange between Charlie and his mother. And what really was fascinating to me was the weight of the moment and how strenuous it was. That's what I call a heavy lifting moment in life between a parent and a child. As a parent myself, I certainly have those. I remember having those with my parents as a child. As adults, in various points, we face our own gap moments, those small hours that are heaviest, where we don't know what the math is going to be, whether it's financially or emotionally or physically, in how to bridge the gaps that come along. And I thought this was probably one of the most perfect scenes that I think's ever been filmed, because there are so many things between those two people who love each other, a mother and a son, that can never be expressed in words. They're just felt. And yet they're also dealing with their own internal sense of the dynamic and the dire nature that life presents. And as I rewatched that on that night when I woke up with the dream and I saw what was happening between Mrs. Bucket and then Charlie Bucket, and the worry and the angst and the pain in their faces and the perspectives, it got me thinking about all of their histories that we don't know about, but you can fill in the blanks, because as the reader or the watcher, those personal experiences begin to add themselves into it. And, the downtrodden nature as Charlie goes home to find, or goes to the laundry to find his mother, where he really does need somebody to talk to. And of course, he's going to go talk to his mom, but he can't tell her what he's really feeling. And he's unsure that she would fully understand, and yet she completely understands. And yet on the flip side, she can't give Charlie everything that he wants. And she knows she can't, but she's there anyway. And it was Diana Soul, by the way, who plays Mrs. Bucket. Peter Ostrom plays Charlie Bucket. And what I love about Mrs. Bucket and the way that's portrayed by Diana Soul, who's a lovely woman, is that she comes across just as she was, and how Roald Dahl created her. She's a very plain woman. She's obviously living a very hard life, and she is yet completely tender to her little boy, and she knows how big his heart is. And sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. When she sings that beautiful song by Leslie Bricusse, "Cheer Up, Charlie," as a parent, it says everything. And as a child, I didn't think that was going to happen. As a child, and I watched that the first time, we didn't have TiVo back then, so I couldn't replay it. But in seeing that on broadcast television as a rerun, those words stuck. I mean, they went right in, and I heard them. So let me transition for just a moment. I'm going to come back to that scene in a little bit later, but I want to now, let's talk a little bit about nuance and why this matters and what was driving and was the heartbeat of that essay. Nuance matters, and why I've considered it for so long, because for me, and I'm going to give a lot of my definition, and this isn't some dictionary definition here. It's an applied definition based on my experience, based on my reading, based on my intake of film and music and experiences in life. I'm going to apply that, and that's what that essay was. It was an application of nuance. But nuance changes language entirely. It's changed mine. It eliminates indifference. It changes my outlook. It changes one's outlook in general, and heightened sensibility to a broader, more flawed world. And I think that's the key, a sensibility to the flawed world, which I think in a lot of ways, and I'm going to touch on this a bit later, is we have a tendency as human beings to want only to look at a cartoon version of life. And we underserve our experience and our humanity when we do that, and we do that often. And nuance is one of those beautiful words that sounds like an elegant experience, which it is. It's a subtle word. It's hard to define. I think we all think we know what it means, but we really don't. But that's also how life is. We think we know what life is, but we really don't. And nuance is a reminder that there is a lot more involved than the binary. There's no black, white, right, wrong, left, right. I mean, there are those things, but there's so much more in between all of that. And nuance dances in that space. It reminds us that there are flaws everywhere. And if we're not paying attention to them, our language is going to be left vague, empty. Our hearts will be shortened, minimized. We won't feel what we probably think we say we're going to feel because we won't recognize it. Nuance encourages us to get into that. I'm going to go ahead and give you various definitions out of dictionaries. Feel free to look it up if you'd like, but there are a lot of different words or a lot of different definitions. I kind of cobbled this from 8 or 9 different dictionaries. Nuance, a subtle distinction or variation, quality, a sensibility to, awareness of, ability to express delicate shadings of meaning, feeling, and value. And then I thought, what are 2 words that dance well with nuance? And the 2 that come immediately to mind are empathy and irony. And let me just read various definitions of that. Empathy, action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, the imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object so as to infuse it with its grace and perspective. Irony, which I love, but how often do we really know what ironic means? I mean, I like Alanis Morissette, isn't it ironic? But don't you think? But beyond maybe what we think that song's about, what is really irony about? Irony dances with nuance, and it's an incongruity understood by the audience but not by the characters in the play. A literary technique originally used in Greek tragedy by which the full significance of a character's words or actions are clear to the audience or reader, although unknown to the character. And who I thought of when I read the definition for irony was Polonius in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Polonius, who is oft misquoted by anybody that wants to sound pretentious and important. They'll reach for Polonius because he gives this sage advice to his son Laertes, and Polonius is just a horse's ass of a human being, and Shakespeare was being ironic in giving him some of the most eloquent, sage advice that comes out through the mouth of this just bilious dipshit. who really didn't understand what he was speaking. And that's another form of nuance, also ironic. So that kind of came into my mind. And now I'm going to cross all the way over to one of my most favorite writers in contemporary politics today. Her name is Ms. Anne Applebaum. She's American. She lives in Poland. She's a staff writer for The Atlantic, and she wrote a book just this last year called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Anytime I see anything with Anne Applebaum's name on it, I read every word. She's beautiful. She's elegant. She is completely beyond intelligent. She just has a great pulse of life, and she's one of the most articulate, strong, voiced writers in contemporary politics and life today. And I actually hope, I don't think she's written any fiction, but I wish she would because I love what she has to say. But I'm going to quote from Anne Applebaum this line from this book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, that is so apt to what I'm getting at here. She said and she's speaking about just people in general, leaders as well, but I'll just leave it at that. There is a lot more. I'm pulling this right out of her book. She says, quote, "They are not interested in a nuanced past, in a world in which great leaders were flawed men, in which famous military victories had lethal side effects. They don't acknowledge that the past might have had its drawbacks. They want the cartoon version of history." And I borrowed that. I used the cartoon, but that's where that comes from. "And more importantly, they want to live in it right now. They don't want to act out roles from the past because it amuses them. They want to behave as they think their ancestors did without irony. It is not by accident that restorative nostalgia often goes hand in hand with conspiracy theories and the medium-sized lies." What a beautiful and powerful paragraph. And so when I read that, and, I had this idea for, wanting to do something with nuance, and then I read that and I'm layering in other things that I'm reading. I'm just like, wow, this is amazing how deep this can go. It really brought that to the fore. An extension to go beyond now. Now I'm getting back into kind of the space that I've been swimming in. When I think about nuance, it's a refinement of perspective. It encourages more layered interpretations. It plumbs, as it were, the refined sound of truth in the language of our lives, our homes, our lands, our shared world. It eviscerates vague emotional vocabulary. When I really thought about it, I was like, what is it that really counts for me as a man? And, if I think about definitions and words and language, then of course I'm a literary man. I'm somebody who spends a good portion of his waking hours thinking about language. I'm drawn to reading it. I want to write it. I'm always thinking about what it is I see in the words that shape in my mind and in my mouth. What's the carryover for that? I think central to all of that, and this goes hand in hand with this sense that I'm getting at here with nuance, is wonder. That's the central, if I looked at a physical body, if nuance was a body, what's the heartbeat of that? And it's wonder. I really do. I think wonder, not only wonder in a sense of, wow, I wonder, this is wonderful, or the wonder of the world. It's also a wonder in the sense of curiosity. It's an ability to see something that maybe just as we see it, maybe just as the media would state it, or just as a leader will state it, or a church, whatever. And they could all be correct. But when you really look at it and wonder, there's so much more than what's on the surface. And wonder is the central element that drives nuance. And when we diminish our sense of wonder, we diminish our sense of humanness, our commonness. We diminish our ability to see beyond what we only want to see. And as Anne Applebaum talked about, we linger back to that cartoon version of things. I believe personally, I think the idea in this life for me is to seek commonness in the humanity that I'm learning about. I don't understand all of my own humanity. God knows I'm going to spend my life trying to. But the only way I'm going to figure that is I got to get away from me and I got to think about others. It's the power of others and the wonder about others as opposed to the wonder about myself. And the irony of that is that the moment I do that, I find so much more about who I am. I see myself reflected in the face of Charlie Bucket, or in Walt Whitman, or in Anne Applebaum, or in William Shakespeare. Maybe I even relate to Polonius, as I talked about, who was kind of a pompous ass. I can be that at times, sure. But on the flip side, I also see what Shakespeare was doing in that moment when he wrote about Polonius, because he's also kind of turning wisdom on its head to say that this may be good wisdom, but look at the source from which it's coming from. And it makes you wonder. So again, a sense of nuance. How it ought to be, even as it really is right now, is something to consider. There's a nuanced history that is always messy, but so is life. And isn't it interesting? And this is a rhetorical question I asked myself. So why do we prefer the false cartoon versions of a scrubbed history? I'm not going to answer that. I think we can answer that for ourselves. Because to see things as they were and really are, and this is kind of an enjoinder to that, is really that takes harder courage. There's a reason why we don't do that. I think it expends too much energy sometimes, and maybe we're a little afraid to get into the mess. My mom used to tell me from the time I was just a little kid, and it's one of the great adages of my mother in teaching me. She was in that moment like a Mrs. Bucket to my Charlie Bucket, was life is messy. It was a maxim in the Staker home. Life is messy. And we'd hear that a lot. And in hearing that, it'd be like, yeah, life's messy. But as I've gone through life, there are moments like, damn it, life is a freaking mess. And it is. And sometimes it's too much to deal with the mess, and we don't want to. We have to clean it up. I am a hyper clean person. I drive my wife nuts because I'm very organized and I'm very proper and clean, and the house is always clean, and I just do it anyway. It's not like because I'm trying to, but I think sometimes my own obsessive compulsive nature of overly organizing the world around me also is a way of me not dealing in the nuance I probably should. And I'm guilty of that. What's interesting is I'm aware of it. I'm emotionally aware of that. And yet I also fight that battle on a daily basis where, maybe I'm not exacting enough courage to exist in the mess a little bit more, because the mess is where I'm gonna expand and maybe also allow for things that not only are important to me but for those around me. So this is a lesson that I'm still learning. I haven't figured this one out. I'm just very aware of it. Let me transition briefly to Toni Morrison. I'm just going to give a little plug here. I intend my next essay to be entirely about an experience that I've had with Toni Morrison, who I've adopted as one of my godmothers, by the way. I'm just going to say it. But over the course of the last 2 calendar years, really hasn't been a full 2 years, but starting at the end of 2019, all through last year, the pandemic year of 2020, and just up to about last 2 weeks ago, I read everything that she wrote, all of her novels, all of her collected essays, speeches, reminiscences, mementos. I know she wrote some children's stories. I haven't read those, but I read all of it because I've always wanted to, but I went through the oeuvre, as they would say, and it changed everything for me. I knew who she was for years. I did, but I never gave it a serious study. And I'm going to write an essay about that. That's coming. It's going to be an emotionally charged essay about that experience in language. She is truly one of my godmothers. I admire her, but she wrote something in, I don't even remember where I took this from. And in fact, I'm paraphrasing and cobbling probably 4 or 5 other things that she said, but I put this into one little condensed thought where writers remember. And I'm going to give, this is what she was talking about. And she said, to remember this world is to create it. The frisson is the French word, or the thrill of the red rooftops that I describe in my essay, was this sense of wonder. It's a sense of memory. It was a sense and a reminder of nuance. And when I was flying into Belgium that first time, and I saw those red rooftops, it stunned me. Man, even now, I've seen some really freaking beautiful things. And how plain is it to fly into Europe? And if anybody's done it, it's no different than flying into any other city in the U.S. in its own way. I mean, every place is unique. But when you fly into a place in Western Europe particularly, the red rooftops I'm talking about are quite common. So I'm not describing anything that's out of the world, whatever. But for me, man, it blew me away. I'm sitting on this jet, and we come through that cloud deck, and the frisson, the thrill of those red rooftops, it stunned me, because all of a sudden I was back in that closet in 1982 as a little boy, and I'm watching Willy Wonka hovering in the Wonkavator, and I'm right there with him. And I'm looking out over this enchanted city, which was just the common city that Charlie Bucket himself really didn't want to live in anymore. He wanted to be in the chocolate factory. And how ironic that at the end of the film, Willy Wonka takes him up out of the chocolate factory. And he's looking out over the very same world that he thought he'd left. And now here I am all these years later, and I'm seeing the same place. It was Brussels. They filmed that in Munich, but it was the same. And that's what it was, is that writers remember. And I remembered. And it really, really came back. And I thought instantly in that moment, and I'm looking at my notes here, but I remember thinking instantly, I heard Gene Wilder's voice, and this is not a joke. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the chocolate room. Hold your breath, make a wish, count to 3. Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. And if you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it. And I was viewing paradise. It came back so, so strong. So now I want to transition just briefly to Albert Camus. He describes something about in his unfinished manuscript, which was published after he was killed. And I'm going to touch on that in more depth here in just a moment, or at least another avenue to this. But he talks about a stirring deep down and wherewithal to see into it life, as he described it, just as it is. And that there is a decency and a clear-sightedness that comes when you can see into it, into life, into its absurdities and its disparate nature that can be life-affirming and changing. And so this led to a further example of Camus with his novel, The Plague, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But right before that, to bring the Camus Plague portion into this very, very well, I want to add another little disparate example. And I've done what I've called here, I call this ratatouilleing something, like in the movie, the Disney Pixar film, where the little rat, I can't remember his name now, I'm totally spacing, Patton Oswalt plays him. But anyway, the rat himself, he ratatouilles certain pieces of food and mixes things that don't look like they'd go well together. But when he takes a piece of cheese and like a cherry, all of a sudden fireworks go off. Well, this is one of these little ratatouilles that I put together. And this is me mixing Full Metal Jacket by Stanley Kubrick with Albert Camus' The Plague. So stick with me, because we're getting to the end of this and we'll bring this together. But I think this really brings home the essence of why this essay was important to me and why it is that I'm thinking the way I was thinking. So let me set the stage here a little bit. Stanley Kubrick directed, produced, and wrote the screenplay for the 1987 film Full Metal Jacket, which is a film, it's visceral. It's a very important film. The film is absolute perfection up to the point when they get to Vietnam. When they get to Vietnam, to me, it goes off the rails, and I just think that part of the film, it loses me, except for the very end, but I'm not going to get into the whole film. But the first part, especially of the boot camp, holy cow, talk about being pinned back. It stars Matthew Modine, Adam Baldwin, Vincent Philip D'Onofrio, and it's based on the 1979 novel, The Short Timers, which was written by Gustav Hosford. It's an autobiographical war novel, but he wrote it in kind of a fictitious set. In real life, he was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and he served as a combat correspondent with the 1st Marine Division during the Tet Offensive of 1968. And his writing is the basis for Matthew Modine's character, Private Joker. I only want to talk just briefly about the opening scene of Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. The opening scene depicts barber-chaired young men getting their hair shorn to the scalp, whilst in the background, or the music that's playing during this, as we see these boys getting their heads shaved, is Johnny Wright singing his 1965 hit "Hello Vietnam." The lyric, the chorus, he sings with the voice with a woman who's singing in duet with him in the chorus. "Kiss me goodbye and write me while I'm gone. Goodbye, sweetheart. Hello Vietnam. America has heard the bugle call." So this is playing as these boys are getting their heads shorn down. The obvious humor there mingles with the darkness and is very readily evident. And when I first saw that film, I would have been in high school. I've seen it many, many times after, because I just keep coming back to it. But the first time I saw it, I laughed, and I secretly scorned those men, those boys, turning to men, for looking so bravely ridiculous. They had no control, and they knew it. But this is where the Nuance fills in that gap that I was talking about. When I see that scene now, Nuance steps in, and it steps in really, really hard. And what I think about are the parents of those boys, the moms and dads that held those boys up when they were little and sweet and so full of the joys and hopes they come into this world with. And now they're grown up on the edge of manhood, and yet they are lambs being led to a brutal and unnecessary political slaughter. And I tremble at the thought with my own boys sitting in those barber chairs. It really hit me hard. And I was thinking even within the song that's playing, Hello Vietnam, there's a line where Johnny Wright says out loud, he says, I hope someday the world will learn. And then he goes off giving this message that would be very Americana about, we got to go kill our enemies and do our bit or we're going to lose our freedom. And then as I'm listening to that, I'm applying this sense of nuance where on the one side, I understand exactly what he's saying and it makes perfect sense. But this sense of wonder and irony and empathy and nuance start to come in, and I see a whole different side to this as well. I see the flaws of the American thinking at the time that we went into that war. And how many other wars? Doesn't matter. Pick your country, pick your scenario. There is never a clean-cut space. Life is messy. And Nuance shows those flaws. It exposes those, and if we're willing to dance with nuance, we're also willing to dance with a greater sense of our own humanity. And I think it gives us more pause before we just jump into this headlong, nope, right, wrong, black, white, left, right. And all of a sudden we realize there's a lot more involved here. And maybe this isn't what we thought. And are we sending our sons and daughters off to do things that, quite frankly, really aren't morally right? Or at the same time, we're going to get them killed or hurt because maybe our idea of balance is out of balance with the reality of the human nature of life. And these are all things that started to come back. And so as I thought about Kubrick's Sons to the Slaughter in this sequence, it led me to the recent reading of Albert Camus' third novel, The Plague, which was, he wrote in French, he's French, it was titled in French, La Peste, and came out in 1947. It's technically not his third novel. It's technically his second. His first novel, which was A Happy Death, was written between 36 and 38. It was published in 71 after his death. He wrote The Stranger, which came out in 42, then The Fall, or The Plague came out in 47, then The Fall in 56, and then his last book, The First Man, was incomplete. And he was writing it at the time of his tragic death. He was killed in a horrible car accident in the French countryside in 1960. And you'll have to forgive me. If you're sticking with me, there's a reason why I'm sharing this, is that with this reading and this thinking for nuance, I've been reading all of Albert Camus, much like I was doing with Toni Morrison. And what's ironic here is that Albert Camus died when he was 46 years old. And I didn't start reading Camus until this year, and I'm 46. I'm going to be 47 in May. So I came to Camus in my 46th year. Another sense of irony. Granted, I'm not a published writer yet. Someday I hope I will be, and I think I will be. Camus had written all of this wonderful stuff, and it wasn't just the novels. He wrote incredible essays and just a very deep thinker. And I've been immersing myself in this. And so I want to share this little anecdote with The Plague. In just very brief, The Plague is a sweeping story about the plague. And irony of ironies, obviously we're still going through the COVID-19 pandemic. But it takes place in the French-Algerian city of Oran. And it's just a snapshot narrative of the life of that narrator and the author's absurdist point of view, which is the absurdist philosophy, according to Camus, is just a contradiction between value and the meaning of life. And the power of the imagination, he writes about this in the book. And this is where the tie-in with Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket came together with this ratatouille, as I described it. But he says the power of the imagination in times of plague is the differentiator. The evil in the world comes from ignorance. The murderer's soul is blind. Only clear-sightedness can heal the blight. The only way to fight the plague is with decency. Nuance provides the path to decency and clarity. And again, there was like this chiming zing that came across that said yes. And as I'm thinking about all these things and I'm taking this reading, it's very serendipitous how I get this reinforcement of something I'm thinking about as I'm writing it and in the right time. And here was Camus offering that. And then I started doing some further reading. And what's interesting is in the afterword of the novel, The Plague, Tony Ute, who is no longer with us anymore, he was an English-American historian and essayist, and I think he was the head of the European History Department. I'm probably wrong, but it was at New York University. He died of ALS in 2010, but he wrote an afterword to Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, and I want to read what he wrote here. He says, in Camus' view, it was inertia or ignorance which accounted for people's failure to act. Nuance, an intensely personal book, Camus put something of himself, his emotions, his memories, and his sense of place into all his published work. It accounts for his universal and lasting appeal. Avoiding arousing partisan hackles, took up sensitive topics without provoking a refusal to listen. A nuance of empathy, a rarity among contemporaries, lifts a story clear of the conventions of time. Genuine suffering and guilty memory build into that irony and nuance, and I was struck by his face. It was so human and sensitive. There is in this man such an obvious integrity that it imposes respect almost immediately. Quite simply, he is not like other men and other men. So he's writing that as an observer of Camus, and I just thought that was really, really powerful. And again, really pulled together this idea of this humanness, this commonness, and to get there, that decency, that clarity is in the nuance, in the mess, in the absurdity of life that's all around us. And the great thinkers of our time and the times of antiquity have always been those that have been able to see things as they are as well as they were. And so in closing this production tonight, I want to bring this back to Willy Wonka and the sequence of Charlie Bucket with his mother, Mrs. Bucket. If a sequence could be a sermon, then it was that. And if, as a parent, I could look to something and see a masterful way of not only supporting and loving a child in a moment of deep discouragement and awareness of the harshness of the world that we live in, it's that. And it's why I woke up from the dream, probably. Maybe I had some things on my mind that were along those lines. I don't know. But I had that feeling, and I also had a memory of situations with my own parents where they were there for me. And I was thinking about these, as I described, the gaps. And it tied itself back to the discovery and the wonder of the red rooftops. Everything came together in that sequence. And I recognized above all else that the only way to truly embrace this life, and the way I'm going to really try to be better about, is to take on life in all of its nuance and to see it as it really is. And to remember how Mrs. Bucket could see her own life in the circumstance that she was in a laundry late at night, exhausted, worn out. Her son comes to her with a broken dream, wanting to find a golden ticket that he's probably not going to find. And it could have been a moment where she could have been very harsh, could have been very direct, maybe given him the black and white answer, the right and the wrong answer, the left and the right answer. And she didn't. She exercised a nuance of tenderness and awareness and of wonder. And I even sensed as I watched that scene that she saw herself in her boy, and maybe remembered some of her own dreams. And who knows what Mrs. Bucket's dreams were at that moment. And rather than try to put that about her, she still keeps his dreams for him. And she sings to him, "Cheer up, Charlie." And again, I can't sing worth a damn, but I'm going to close this by doing my best. You get blue like everyone, but me and Grandpa Joe can make your troubles go away, blow away. There they go. Cheer up, Charlie. Give me a smile. What happened to the smile I used to know? Don't you know your grin has always been my sunshine? Let that sunshine show. Come on, Charlie. No need to frown. Deep down you know the world is still your toy. When the world gets heavy, never pitter-patter up an atom, boy. Someday, sweet as a song, Charlie's lucky day will come along. Till that day, you've got to stay in strong, Charlie. Up on top is right where you belong. Look up, Charlie, you'll see a star. Just follow it and keep your dreams in view. Pretty soon the sky is gonna clear up, Charlie. Cheer up, Charlie, do. Cheer up, Charlie. Just be glad you're you. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.